You're listening to Natural Resources University. In this podcast network, our hosts are university researchers and extension specialists, opening your gateway to the science of natural resource management.
Pond University is your one-stop shop for all things pond management. It is hosted by Mitchell Ziske and Megan Gunn from Purdue University and Illinois-Indiana Sea Grant. Join us as we talk with biologists, managers, and pond owners about the topics and tools needed to manage your pond for good habitat and great fishing. So grab a notebook and a beverage and sit back and enjoy Pond University. G'day everyone and welcome back to Pond University, your one-stop shop for all things pond management. I'm your co-host Mitch and I'm joined by Megan Gunn. Hi Megan, how are you?
I'm doing good, Mitch. How are you?
I'm good. Yeah, it's things are rolling along nicely. We're having some great summer weather. I'm spending a little bit of time out in the northeast in Cape Cod,
nice.
So it's been nice to see the ocean and the weather's a little more mild out here than it is in the Midwest. So it's been great.
It's been raining a lot here. The river is so high right now.
Yeah. Well, we've gotten a lot of rain out here too, and we actually copped the tail end of the Hurricane Elsa that came up the coast. So just for one day, we had winds that were gusting to like 60 miles an hour. So
wow.
That was pretty interesting. So, but yeah, it's been really great up here. How about you? Have you been up to anything interesting?
Of course. My summer program finished, and then I went to LA for a few days to spend time with family, and then to Denver.
Great.
It was very nice to see like sunshine,
Mm-hmm.
and not immense heat like we've been having in the Midwest. But yeah, just traveling a little bit.
Yeah, it's nice to be able to travel and see people again, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
For sure.
So, yeah, we've had some friends visiting us as well from different parts of the country. So it's been great to see them. Haven't seen them in probably 2 years. So
wow.
Yeah, it's been really great.
Yeah, just being able to spend time with people again has been really nice.
Exactly. Yeah. And so we've got a pretty interesting episode today, and this episode is a direct result of one of our listeners reaching out to us. So I received an email a few months ago from a listener who said, liked your podcast, and it'd be great to hear some more about water chemistry and some of maybe the things you don't think about when you think of ponds, but actually influence a lot of things in the pond. So we've reached out and connected with a new professor at Purdue whose expertise is in limnology, and he knows a lot about the characteristics of water and how water influences pond and lake systems. And so he's going to come on today and tell us a little bit about some of the chemical components of a pond and what we might be interested in and what we might like to keep an eye on, and how those things influence plants and fish, but also how they influence the management that we do. So that should be a pretty interesting episode. I'm looking forward to learning some stuff as well.
Me too.
Essential Pond Terms, the segment where we hope to expand your vocabulary by defining important terms for pond management. One term that you'll hear in today's episode is eutrophication. Eutrophication refers to the amount of nutrients in a water body. Eutrophic ponds are those that have high nutrients and are often characterized by shallow, turbid water and lots of aquatic vegetation. On the flip side, oligotrophic ponds are those that have low nutrients and are often clear and deep with little vegetation. So back to eutrophication, this basically means that ponds or lakes are increasing in nutrients and becoming more eutrophic. Two other terms that you'll hear are hypoxic and anoxic. These two terms refer to the amount of dissolved oxygen in the water. Dissolved oxygen is typically around 10 milligrams per litre in well-oxygenated water. Hypoxic water is often defined as water that has less than 2 milligrams per litre of oxygen, while anoxic water is water that has no oxygen at all. Hypoxic and anoxic conditions can set up on the bottom of a pond in some cases. Alrighty, well, Today we have Dr. Jake Hosen from Purdue University with us, and he's going to talk about some of the chemical components of ponds and small lakes, and some of the things that you might wish to consider and incorporate into your management. So, hi Jake, how are you?
Good, thanks. How you all doing?
Good.
We're good.
Welcome.
Thanks for joining us today. It's great to have you on the podcast. So Jake, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do and sort of what you've done in the past and how you've gotten to where you are now. I think that it can be important to provide a bit of context about our guests, and so yeah, I don't know. I doubt you're from Indiana originally because not a lot of people are, I guess. But yeah, so tell us about where you're from and what you do.
I'm an ecosystem scientist, and I study all sorts of aquatic ecosystems. And so
Okay.
for me, that includes everything from the big rivers, lakes, and reservoirs we usually think about to a lot of these smaller headwater streams, small ponds that individually, of course, they're very small, but together they have a big cumulative impact. And so I started out with that research in Maryland, where we think a lot about the Chesapeake Bay.
Yeah.
But I thought a lot, my main interest was what we do on the landscape, how we manage these small water bodies, how does that add up to a big impact on larger ecosystems like the Chesapeake Bay? And,
Yeah.
I've continued that work and have really identified a lot of the opportunities that we have now with sensors and
Okay.
computing and big data technology
Hmm.
to provide us with the data that we need to do environmental management better. Because a lot of times what we really don't understand is what's happening at a particular site level. Because I think we're talking here today on a podcast that talks about freshwater pond management, and
Hmm.
people who manage ponds know that every system is different. And so
Hmm.
we realize that we really need a lot of data to answer those questions. But if we do that, we combine that with the sorts of advanced computing technology that we have now, we can provide some really dialed in solutions to say, okay, well, why has the water chemistry of this pond or river or lake changed, and
Hmm.
what are some potential management options then that we can take. Also, to act quickly, that's another benefit of sensors is that they provide data um, all the time, and so we can perhaps identify problems with water bodies, both large and small,
Yeah.
before they get really out of control. And so I do that with sensors, water chemistry, and then incorporate microbial communities into that as well, since they're really driving a lot of the water quality issues that we see on a big scale. They start with the microbial community.
Okay. Well, that's great. I mean, that sounds very interesting, and there are a couple of things I want to just ask you a few questions about, I think you make a great point that these small systems are small in size, and but quite often they're not small in complexity. I think
Hmm.
some people think a small system is like a puddle, but there can be lots going on and lots of diversity in them. And you mentioned you were looking about what the cumulative effect of these small systems might be on a large system like the Chesapeake Bay or a large river. Um, but I think too, a lot of our pond owners, they might have ponds that are fairly isolated in space. There's some runoff into them on the land, but they may not necessarily flow into other systems. But I think collectively these ponds that people build and people have on their properties are really important socially, right? They're really important for recreation. In the Midwest, fishing on private ponds is usually the number one location that people fish in, and so even if these smaller ponds are not all feeding into a large system or anything like that, I think they are feeding into the large sort of
Hmm.
recreational fishing and recreation space where we need to try and improve the management of these collectively so that we can add value to that recreation.
Oh yeah, that's a really great point. And they also really something that I think people don't always talk about is that being disconnected is a benefit that ponds provide. because when they're disconnected like that, first of all, they serve as reservoirs for flood control. And
Yep.
so
Okay.
water that is sitting in a pond is water that's not heading downstream, causing
True.
flooding in a river. And they also can retain nutrients. And so a lot of times, like in my research, we don't really draw a strong line between ponds and wetlands because a lot of the time a pond and a wetland are really the same thing. There's no strict definition between the two. And so ponds are accomplishing the same goal that wetlands do of retaining a lot of sediment and a lot of nutrients that actually help drive a healthy pond community and also prevent water quality problems downstream. And so that disconnection can actually be a real service to the ecosystem.
Yeah, and that reminds me of the guest we had on the last episode was talking about sedimentation a little bit and the pond's ability to capture and retain nutrients and sediment can actually cause some issues for the pond owner because they become shallow, they become eutrophic. But our last guest was talking about in some situations you can build a small, 1/10 of an acre retention pond above your pond and use that as a to capture some of these things, and then your own pond system can have less sedimentation and stuff like that. And if you take that to the next level, well, yeah, a lot of the ponds we have are trapping all that stuff before it ends up in streams and rivers and the Chesapeake or the Gulf of Mexico or something like that.
Yeah, and that's a really great point. And I think innovative solutions like that can be a real win-win. Because that retains, if you're retaining that sediment that's packed with nutrients, that's actually really great soil, and so that could be reused. So that an individual someone who has a pond on their personal property, they may not be able to do this, but for farmers, that's actually money that they can save on fertilizer by reusing that soil. And in fact, the water in a lot of these ponds in agricultural landscapes, we're now realizing that these ponds and wetlands, well, guess what? These are great water supplies as well for when things start drying up as well. And so that's actually some of the research that I'm working on right now is how do we manage ponds and wetlands so that they're both providing these nutrient retention benefits that we're looking for. But they also can provide a water supply for irrigation when things start to dry up.
Yeah, that's a great point. And then I guess one of the other things I wanted to ask you a little bit about, and I know this from working with you at Purdue, but I'd like to learn more about this too, is I know you work a lot with sensors and building sensors and stuff like that. And I guess, I'm just imagining, hopefully not too far down the road, that it's economical and feasible for anybody who owns a pond or a wetland or whatever on their property, that they could put some sensors out in there that they, it's like most people now have weather sensors on their house, and they can monitor the weather in real time and keep an idea on weather. And I feel like, if we could put some of these cost-effective and reliable sensors out in these ponds and wetlands and whatever, these landowners could have sort of real-time information coming in that can really help them manage their ponds more effectively. So tell us a little bit about, the sensors that you work with, that you're building, how do they, what sensors are, I don't know much at all about sensors. And so, what sensors are out there now and what are some of the gaps that you're trying to fill with what you're doing? Yeah,
that's a great question. Because the prices are already coming down, but you're still talking, getting close to $1,000 or into the thousands of dollars to really get a proper set of sensors now for managing your pond that are reliable. There are things that are at even lower price points, but you start to get into the area where failure rate and data quality are really low. And so you might, just be better off saving your money. But we are very close, I think, to having those sorts of deployable sensor kits that will give you that full water quality spectrum at a similar price point to what you can get with those air quality and weather monitoring stations.
Okay.
The thing that slowed it down a lot has been that water and electricity are just difficult. It's difficult to mix, and so you need more of a contained package. We don't really want to have cables running out of the water, things like that. So you want to have something that can be deployed via battery for a long time. And so what you're paying for typically with the systems that are available now is that sort of technology advancement that they've done to have this waterproof device that can run on a small battery for a very long amount of time. And the result is that a temperature sensor alone typically costs about $100 if you want to be waterproof. And that's, compared to the temperature sensor that you're using in your weather station, that's a bit more expensive. And so that's true with everything. But things like temperature, pH, salinity, which is also known as conductivity. So that's the amount of dissolved things in your water. A lot of that is salts. And also dissolved oxygen sensors. Those are all fairly broadly available, but you're going to be spending at minimum $200 per sensor. And if you want a completely integrated system that's really properly, it's really easy to operate out of the box, you're really getting into the thousands of dollars. So if you're a tinkerer, you can save a lot of money. But if you want that integrated solution, you're like, oh, I don't want to have to, set up this and that. Then it is thousands of dollars. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to bring this more of this embedded computing technology. So the really low power, small computers that you find in an increasing number of devices. For example, in your headphones now, if you have Bluetooth headphones, they have a tiny little computer in them. And so we can use those tiny computers and provide low-cost water quality sensors. And so what we're doing is we're trying to bring that to a broader audience, because right now that's very doable, but you have to be very knowledgeable in programming and some electrical engineering, and so it's very involved. And so we're working to make that something that's easy so that people can use off-the-shelf products to create water quality monitoring systems for a couple $100 rather than a couple $1,000. And so it's something where it's an iterative process, but we'll soon be rolling out some designs for temperature and salinity sensors. Those are very reliable. They can work for a long time. And that actually gives you a lot of information. If you're a pond manager, temperature is a really important issue. Salinity, conductivity, of course, that's if you have road salt application nearby, that can actually be an issue. And that's something that fish and the insects and other organisms that they feed on, they're very sensitive to those changes in salinity. So those are relevant things. And then we'll be expanding out to dissolved oxygen, pH, and as well as some other constituents and gases like methane very soon. So that's from the research side, we're very interested in methane production from these ponds, but that's not much of a management issue, of course.
So how far out is the commercial ability, I guess, of these sensors? So it sounds like you're on a roll, and soon is it like next year or in the next few years?
So I think that within the next year or so there are already some devices out there that do similar things to what we do. One is known as the Mayfly. It's created by this organization, EnviroDIY. It doesn't do exactly what we want it to do, and it's kind of geared towards a slightly different audience. And it isn't quite as easy to use out of the box as we'd like to have ours be, but it's available right now. And we'll have we have a similar board that we'll have available. So these loggers, that's really, there are many sensors out there on the market. But the key for water quality data is having that logging device that can collect those data.
Yeah.
And so that's what we focused on, is a logger that can use all these sensors effectively. And so you can get one of those right now, and I think that within a year it'll be something that you can at least get temperature and salinity. Just take it, put it in the water, and be ready. Just be collecting data. And then from there, we hope that we'll be able to add additional sensors every year or two. So hopefully
That's really neat.
in the next couple of years,
Okay.
we'll have something we can actually sell to you.
Yeah,
It
that's
sounds
great.
like the perfect addition to a pond owner's toolkit.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of potential, and it also can help for coming up with unconventional management solutions. If you're concerned about temperature, I think a lot of times pond owners also can be concerned if they have a lot of like floating weeds covering the surface of their pond. That can kind of look very concerning. But actually, those pond weeds can really help regulate temperature. And so if you're having that issue with fish, if you have a sensor there, you can actually say, oh, well, these pond weeds, they're having a positive benefit. I would like to
Yeah.
target these cold water species. And actually, I see it's not detrimentally impacting water quality, but it is helping with temperatures. So I'm a big believer that data can really help us come up with unconventional solutions.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think one thing we encourage on this podcast is to think about the whole system, the whole ecosystem, and it's pretty the reaction of I've got a lot of plants, let's put herbicides in there to kill them off. That's a pretty knee-jerk reaction, and I think by better understanding the ecosystem, you can really improve your management. You can come up with creative alternatives, and you can save yourself money too, because a lot of these knee-jerk reactions are expensive, and if you can do other things or collect other data that tells you don't need to do that, then that can save you money and have a positive impact on your pond overall. So
Yeah, absolutely. Because there are things like, and this is something, this is where I think that sensor data and these big data approaches can really help drive even like more advanced economic analysis. Is that one reason why you may want to be keeping plants out of your pond is that you're worried about sedimentation that's going to encourage the pond to fill in more quickly. But the increased cost of herbicides and the resulting additional management, because once you lose that vegetation is also helping to regulate water quality, water temperature, and so you're going to spend money on herbicides, and then you're going to have to spend additional money trying to figure out how to solve the oxygenation problem that the plants were providing a solution to, how to regulate temperature. And so you may look at it and be like, well, actually, I'm spending more money solving all of these problems. And so even if I have to dredge out my pond every 10 years, that's actually cheaper than doing all of this fine scale management. But we can only figure out if that's true if we apply data to the problem.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I think it's something that maybe a lot of people don't think about, because a lot of pond management, particularly people doing it on their own, is more of a hobby or a recreation thing that they do, and they may not necessarily think about, well, money I'm spending now or money I'm spending every year versus like a longer term investment, dredging out every so often, or putting an aerator in, once every 10 years or something like that. So yeah, that's an important thing to think about. Pond Species Profile, the segment where we will showcase the biology and ecology of popular and not so popular pond species. In today's episode, we will profile hybrid sunfish, also known as hybrid bluegill. You may have seen hybrid sunfish for sale at your local fish hatchery, or you may even have them in your pond. Hybrid sunfish are typically the result of crossing bluegill with green sunfish. They take the aggressive habits and fast growth of green sunfish and combine it with the large size and good eating qualities of bluegill. The benefits of hybrid sunfish in ponds are that they grow fast and reach large sizes. However, as these hybrid sunfish reproduce, their genetics revert back to their original species. Therefore, it is common that after a few generations, your population is almost entirely pure bluegills. If you are interested in having sustainable hybrid populations, you may need to periodically stop hybrid sunfish into your pond. And so, we've talked a little bit about the research that you've done and that you're doing, and these sensors, which I think is really exciting and really interesting, and we could probably talk about that for another hour. But one thing I want to switch gears to a little bit is, you've mentioned some of these water chemistry parameters, some of these characteristics, temperature, pH, salinity, and so I'd like to just talk to you a little bit about, helping our listeners understand what these measures are. And also, how they might influence things in their pond. And so, I think, I get a lot of questions about pH and about hardness in water and about how that might be influencing things. But I think I think you started with talking about temperature and how temperature is a really important variable. And I think it's, a lot of people think, well, the pond's hot or it's cold and that's sort of the end of it. But temperature, we've talked a little bit about before, temperature drives stratification in the pond, these water levels separating, and that can have big impacts on oxygen and fish, fish health. And so, we can start with temperature and we can maybe step into some of these other parameters you mentioned as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We could talk about temperature we could talk about it for the rest of the podcast and then some. It's such a master variable, but because it does tie into a lot of these other things, and depending on your situation, your desire for temperature and even stratification can be really different. So a lot of times when you think about temperature, hot versus cold, just very simply, is this a system that can support, for example, cold water species, or is it not? And that's usually based on, of course, the depth of the water body, the amount of shade, canopy cover you have, if it's an isolated system. Potentially the stream, if it's being fed by a stream, of course, that's going to drive the temperature a lot. And so we want a system to be, to support cold water fish, or cooler water fish, if that's an objective. But stratification isn't necessarily bad, actually. So what happens when things start to warm up? In the summer, this actually happens in the winter as well, when temperatures are consistently cooler. But in the summer, we get stratification where warmer water sits on top, colder water sits on the bottom of the pond, and there's not much mixing between those two layers because the warmer water is less dense. A lot of folks are probably familiar with that. And often we think about it as a bad thing, because what can happen is you can have real anoxic conditions develop in that bottom layer. But it's also a natural condition. And so what happens if things get really hot and you have a lot of algae production is you can get eutrophication. We've heard about that in the Gulf of Mexico, for example, with dead zones, the Chesapeake Bay, where you have too much algae production. And then the algae die, they go down to that bottom layer. And that's what consumes a lot of oxygen and can detrimentally impact water quality. But that bottom layer being sealed off, a lot of nutrients are down in the sediment as well, and that includes a lot of the phosphorus that can be a problem for pond managers. And so stratification also prevents all of the algae that are going to be living. They're only going to live in the top layers. They won't be able to access that phosphorus. And so actually having a little bit of stratification, as long as you don't have really extreme temperatures in your surface water, is actually not a really bad thing. The other thing is you want to make sure that you do have your algae in control. If you have too much algae, then the stratification becomes a much bigger problem. But a little bit, if is actually not really is something that's natural and is beneficial in some cases.
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about. We've spoken about stratification a lot, but mostly from the negative standpoint, particularly in the summer or in the wintertime, and also when that turns over, and I know a lot of pond managers and pond owners will use diffusers and aerators to try and break down that stratification. But that's an interesting take on it, is that, you know, it can limit some of the potentially bad things in your pond to certain areas and stuff like that. So yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned the aerators, which is, yeah, that's and that's one of the main reasons those are used. They're also used, of course, for oxygenation. But if you do have like a good functioning plant community in there, they're actually going to be much more effective at providing oxygenation. The aerators, the number of aerators that you need to really recreate some of the natural aeration that the right plant community can do, it's quite a large number. It's not anything that anyone's going to want to put in their pond, that's for sure. So yeah, it definitely, like, sometimes you want to get rid of that anoxic zone at the bottom. If you have a lot of nutrients going into your system, stratification is going to be a problem, and there's probably not much else you can do but break it up. But if you don't have a really nutrient-loaded system where you're having lots of problems with algae, it may be better to leave that stratification be.
Interesting.
Is there like a preventative area? Like, it seems kind of gray. You either wait until you have an algae problem to then deploy the aerators, or you don't aerate it, you know? When should we use a diffuser?
So I think that's in a lot of cases that's very individual, and this is something where you want to look at your system. But I would tend to use it only after you've identified a problem and you specifically think that you have that need. But a lot of times, for example, this is something where this may be an unpopular opinion because it's not super aesthetic, but if you have a lot of problems with algae blooms, rather than trying to have an aerator to recirculate the water more, it may make sense to not be mowing as much around your pond. Having buffer strips of vegetation around the pond removes sediment and nutrients going into the pond. And also can provide shading, so that reduces photosynthesis and temperatures as well. And so things like that may actually be more beneficial because with the aerators, at the end of the day, something like an algae bloom, this is going to sound kind of maybe a little bit wild, but it's not the worst thing in the world in a small pond. It's not something that you want to have happen. But your system should be able to bounce back from it, especially if you take action fairly quickly. And so I think that because of the potential downsides, the costs of applying something like an aerator, I'd want to wait and make sure that I actually needed it before applying it. So maybe it has to do something with your risk tolerance. And if you're going to have a problem, like we see them a lot in stormwater management ponds in some areas, because in the areas that stormwater management ponds around, large developments and things like that, we know there's going to be an oxygenation problem because there's a lot of, stuff running off the pavement and things like that. So in that case, it's like, oh, well, we're going to have to do this. But in some cases, if you're borderline, you might want to try mitigating the problem in other ways first.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think, we've talked about this a little bit before, but, I think keeping an eye on your pond, recording some data, measuring things, getting a good understanding of where the water's coming from. Do you have nutrient problems? And if you have mild algal blooms that pop up occasionally, you're right. Maybe that's fine. That's okay. But if you're getting them bad blooms every year, then that is probably going to tell you might need to be doing something about those. And I think it's just becoming more familiar with your pond, whether you have a new property or whether you've had a pond that's been neglected for a while. I think just becoming more familiar with it and just observing for a couple of years to really see what it's like and what you might have to do to sort of get that closer to your goals. And I think one of the other things that people struggle with sometimes too is that they might have conflicting goals, right? If I think most people are aware of the benefits of aquatic vegetation, particularly those people who want to grow good fish populations. And most people, I think, a lot of people know what a buffer strip is and how it can benefit a pond. And so, in an ideal world, people will have a pond with, 20, 30, or 40% vegetation, good variety of vegetation. Some sections of the pond have a nice buffer strip around them. But then when you want, if you want people swimming in the pond, or you want to have your beautiful lawn manicured up to the edge, like when you start to get those conflicting goals, then that's when management can get tricky, because you've got one of your goals, like having a clear pond for swimming, working against the other goal of having a self-sustaining, pond that can grow good fish. So
Yeah, that's a really good point. And it can be important to think about what your goals are coming into it, because there are, especially if you're willing to accept some compromises, that can help a lot. One thing that this is maybe the most surprising thing that I might mention here today is that one thing that really helps deal with this temperature problem, algae blooms, stratification, is actually the color of the water. So everyone thinks about water that is clear as being kind of the ideal, that's clean water. But naturally, a lot of these ponds, we're in the Midwest here, and so a lot of ponds in the Midwest, these are natural ponds. They've been around for a long time. And before we changed the landscape, there were lots of wetlands surrounding the ponds, and that made the pond water a lot darker, a brown, tannin-driven color. And that color serves to reduce light penetration, which stops photosynthesis, and it can also help reduce temperatures because it's not taking up as much of the light to the same depth. And so it's actually been shown that it can have a lot of beneficial effects on food webs that result in more fish in your ponds. But it also, a lot of folks don't think that it looks all that great, because we expect clean water to be crystal clear. But if you're willing to accept that change in water color, there's actually even products that are available so that you can tint your pond yourself. So if you have a lot of algae problems, you could think about, well, I could apply a lot of herbicide, but you also might be able to apply a tint. And some of these aquashade products that are out there will even tint your water. They'll darken the water, but it'll still maintain more of a blue color, so that you won't have that like really brown water that I think everyone, there's nothing wrong with it, but I think everyone feels weird about swimming around in what looks like a giant pond of tea.
Yeah, that's true. So to switch gears a little bit, let's talk about some of these other water chemistry parameters. And I think, a couple that pop up a lot are pH. You've mentioned salinity as well. And, a lot of people might not think too much about salinity because these are freshwater systems, but I imagine salinity varies quite a bit. And so can you talk a little bit about those parameters and what that might mean for pond management?
Yeah, absolutely. Though I will say that in a lot of cases, the advice is keep it not too high, not too low, and you're gonna be in good shape. We can maybe start. In some ways, it's tempting to start with pH, but I think I'll actually talk about alkalinity and hardness, and we can kind of work our way up to pH. If that sounds good.
That's great.
Since they're kind of related. And so hardness is one I feel like I think about a lot living in central Indiana. We have very hard water here, and that means that we have a lot of dissolved salts. In particular, calcium and magnesium are typically the dissolved ions in these salts that are really driving hardness the most. And so we generally think about hardness very negatively, because it makes detergents like the soaps we use in our house. If you have hard water, you probably know that you get a lot of soap scum when you're washing your hands. It takes an eternity to get the soap off of your hands. and it's because the calcium and magnesium are preventing that from happening, and they're helping to keep the soap on your hands and stopping you from being able to rinse it off. But in the water, they're not really an issue, and in fact, you want to have at least a little bit of hardness, because otherwise you don't have enough ionic strength in the water, and so it's that if you remember from like biology class, the cells, if you put the plant cell in distilled water with nothing else dissolved, the cell's going to explode. The ionic strength is wrong.
Okay.
So you need a little bit of those salts. I guess maybe another example would be that's why we drink Gatorade, is because it helps to maintain that ionic strength. And so hardness, those hard the things that make water hard, a little bit of those are good because they're providing those ions, and they're in fact magnesium and calcium are nutrients that are needed, so they should be in the system anyway.
And I guess too that the hardness of that water, like you said, in central Indiana we have hard water. That also allows like these ponds to be quite productive. In the south where you get systems with quite soft water, they have naturally low productivity, and then pond owners are looking to things like fertilization and other things to promote production. But I know that you might think of nutrients as a problem because you've got this algae or whatever. But we're lucky in the Midwest in the sense that we have naturally productive systems due in part to this harder water.
Yeah, that's a really great point. It helps. The hardness often comes with higher carbonate levels, which help to regulate pH, and it provides it basically can help provide that healthy food web as well, by starting at the bottom of the food web. And you also want the hardness to be, you want it to be, I think the guideline is you want at least 50 ppm of hardness, just so that you have enough calcium and magnesium for a healthy ecosystem.
Okay.
And I think the main downsides of hardness would be that if you're applying some chemicals like pesticide or herbicides, and not pesticides, like an herbicide, the hardness will require you to, I think, add a little bit more of certain compounds because it'll stick to some of the herbicide. But that's a very, that's a chemical by chemical thing, and there's information on that.
And in a lot of cases there are alternatives too. Like I know water with high hardness reduces the effectiveness of copper sulfate, but then you can get chelated copper compounds that help prevent that binding and can work if you have hard water. And they're a little bit more expensive, but you can still get some stuff that's effective in your hard water.
Yeah, exactly. And that's really your only option, since trying to remove that water hardness is probably not going to be a feasible solution. But the good news is your fish are not gonna be disturbed by hard water as much as we are, I guess.
And that's something people can just test with a simple shake test tube, right? They don't have to go out and get any special equipment to test the hardness of their water.
Yeah, no, those kits are readily available, and they're actually pretty accurate. So that's something. The sensor technology is we're still working on that in a lot of areas, making that usable and affordable and accurate. But a lot of those test kits, those are versions of the same chemical analysis that we do in the lab in many cases. So those are very reliable. So yeah, related in many cases to hardness is alkalinity, which is that buffering capability of water, and that's a lot of times driven by carbonates. And so if you're worried, so that's important because that buffering helps to control your pH. And so that's, I guess, where I say we could get to pH last, because that alkalinity is really, it's not 100% related to pH, but the higher your alkalinity is, typically the more controlled your pH is. And so it's not going to vary as much. It's what we call it's more buffered. And so typically you want your pH to be around neutral or a little bit above neutral. So neutral is 7. That's just pure water. And we want something that's a little bit more basic, typically. But anywhere from like 6.5 to I think 8.59 is considered fairly optimal. And in places like central Indiana, it's going to be hard to get your pH below 8 because there's so much alkalinity in the water. So there's lots of carbonates, and those serve to buffer, but they also have an ideal pH that's a little bit higher than neutral. And so things like carbonate will push your pH up a bit, but then they'll also have the advantage of helping with buffering, and then they help with productivity as well. So it's also something that we maybe aren't super pleased that we have this, high alkalinity water in our tap water, but your pond's not too concerned about that. And you actually want, again, if you're going to add any chemicals, a lot of the chemicals that we add, like herbicides, are acidic. And so you actually want to have a base level of alkalinity before you add any chemicals, because otherwise you may end up crashing the pH and getting really acidic pond water, and that can cause even bigger problems than you're looking to solve.
Okay, interesting.
That's really, like, to me, that's the one, like, pH is the one you really want to keep an eye on. You don't want it to be too high, because high alkalinity, we think about, so low pH means it's more acidic. And of course we think about, acidity, it's corrosive. We associate it with burning. But really high pH, really alkaline environments are also very unhealthy, and even corrosive. Things like, we know about lye is something that you think about can cause a chemical burn. Well, lye has a very high pH, is a pH of like 13, 14, which is as high as pH can go. And it has that same corrosive property. And so you don't want your pH to be too out of control either, excessively high. And that's another thing that those natural compounds, the tannins and things that you see in the water, they help to keep the pH down a little bit as well. They're mild acids, and so a little bit of them present in the water actually helps with the buffering capacity of your water.
Okay. And so I guess one last thing I wanted to ask a little bit about is, we know that a lot of, these things vary from pond to pond and from region to region. And I think, most people, it's pretty obvious that temperature and oxygen is something that's going to vary day to day and throughout the season. But do some of these other, water chemistry parameters, will they vary from day to day as well as throughout the season, or are they more static in a pond?
So things like hardness is fairly static, but a lot of these other things actually change a lot.
Okay.
And so that's something to keep in mind with pH, is that pH is dependent in part on the level of photosynthesis that's happening in your pond, and can change throughout the day. If you have a fair amount of photosynthesis, you maybe have some emergent plants in your pond, they'll increase pH during the middle of the day, and then at night the pH will be a little bit lower.
Okay.
So it can fluctuate a lot. The same with dissolved oxygen. For the same reason, photosynthesis produces dissolved oxygen during the day. And so if you're worried about anoxia, for example, it's, high noon is not the best time to check because your oxygen levels may be really high, but you could also have the issue where they're crashing down at night. And then things like alkalinity, hardness, as I mentioned, those are generally not going to vary as much, but things like salinity could if you have road salt applications. So that's something that people that you probably want to keep an eye on. Actually, is that's one of the most detrimental things that can happen to your pond when you're maybe not paying attention. Is that if you have a lot of road salts coming through in January or February, those can mostly clear your system by April or May, but they can still have done a fair bit of damage. And so
Okay.
so checking to make sure that you're not that your pond's not getting hit by road salts, and then
It's
maybe
really interesting.
thinking about ways to change water delivery could be really beneficial, because that's something where the salt goes away, but the damage has been done essentially.
Yeah. No, that's some great advice, and something honestly I had never thought of. But I know friends with ponds, and I know you see a lot of these ponds as you're driving by the road, right? And so they're right next to roads, and it's very likely that they're getting road salts into them.
So, Jake, we'd like to ask our guests if they have any recommendations for podcasts, videos, or books for our listeners to learn more about sensors or water quality parameters. Do you have anything that you would recommend?
I do know a couple good podcasts about freshwater science, but neither of them are super easy to find on your standard podcast app. One's called the Streamlines Podcast. It's brand new. It's on Spotify, but otherwise you have to go to extension.sdstate.edu, and you can find the Streamlines Podcast there. The other one is Making Waves, and that's produced by the Society for Freshwater Science. And so if you go to freshwater-science.org, you will find links to that there. You actually get the most up-to-date podcasts from them through their YouTube channel, which you can get to from that link.
So it sounds like you are looking for more data on smaller systems. Are you looking for like private pond owners to collect data to help you with your research collection?
I think soon. It's it's something where I'm like hesitant to start putting out the word just yet, because I'm concerned, like we're about to order 75 more of our like loggers. So I think that I'm going to be looking for stuff, but I'm also concerned that it's going to be like 6 months before we're actually ready to go. So so are you thinking about for like local pond owners,
Yeah,
Megan? Or
if any of our local listeners are interested in participating, could they reach out to you?
But yeah, no, absolutely. So I'll just say this, and that is that yes, in the next, we're gonna start sending out sensor kits probably in the next 6 to 12 months, ideally. So things with the pandemic are a little bit up in the air. We're ordering more stuff, but the shortages that you're hearing about with computer chips and things like that are hitting us. So so folks can definitely reach out to me. Ecosystemscience.io is my website.
Okay.
And I'm optimistic that by this time next year, at the latest, we'll be in a position where we can start sending out some of our beta testing sensor kits to folks, and
Awesome.
help you start collecting some pond data, especially if you want to help share that data with us as well, so we can create better water quality models. That's what we're trying to do.
Awesome.
Yeah. That's
Thanks.
great, and I that I think as that gets closer to launching, we'd love to have you back on, and maybe you could talk a bit more in depth about some of your sensors, and that'd be a great opportunity to put the call out again. But yeah, go to Jake's website. You can reach out to us, and I can put you in contact with Jake if you want to contact him directly too, and we can we can definitely facilitate that. So. But yeah, thanks again, Jake, for coming on our show today. It was really informative. I learned a lot, and I really think some of the stuff you're doing is super cool, and it'd be great to get all of our pond owners all teched up and monitoring their water quality, and just really having their finger on the pulse of what's going on in their pond. So yeah, thanks for the information you've shared, and we'll look forward to getting you back on the podcast one day soon.
Thanks, Jake.
Sounds great. Thank you. It was really great chatting with you all.
Yeah, thanks. So Megan, that was a great episode with Jake. It was really interesting learning more about what he does and learning more about water chemistry and how it relates to ponds. It'd be great to get him back on the show soon. And it'd be really great to see some of these sensors that he's developing. So it'd be great if there's some affordable options out there for pond owners, for researchers, for anybody that's interested in water.
I'm really excited about the community science aspect, because I mean, getting the local community involved, that'll be amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for tuning in again, everybody. If you can find us, follow us on social media. If you like this episode, tell other people about it, share our information with others. Check out some of our affiliate podcasts through the Natural Resources University Network. And if you've liked what you heard, if you have suggestions for other topics, like I said, this episode came directly from an email I got from one of our listeners. So send through your ideas and complete our listener survey, and that'll really help us make sure we can tailor our content specifically to what you want to hear.
Yep.
Thanks. Well, we'll catch you all again soon. Cheerio.
Bye.
Pond University is hosted by Purdue University and Illinois-Indiana Sea Grant. Pond University is part of the podcast network Natural Resources University, which is supported by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you liked Pond University, then check out the other podcasts in the Natural Resources University podcast network. Purdue University and Illinois-Indiana Sea Grant are equal opportunity, equal access, and affirmative action institutions.